Hi, this is Sam Gruber for CSP. Welcome to another adventure and journey to one of my favorite uh, Jewish buildings, spaces, or places. This time we're going back to America and we'll be at one of the most historic synagogues in the United States, located in Cincinnati, Ohio, the heart of the country. We're going to see the Plum Street Temple, also known as the Isaac Wise Temple. And this is the mothership, if you will, of American Reform Judaism. It's a remarkable building for its architecture and its decoration, and it has survived for a long, long time. It was dedicated in 1866 and seen a long history. And we're going to take a look at some of its design today and talk a little bit about its place in American architectural history, but mostly we're just going to spend the time just reveling in the beauty of the place. The Plum Street Synagogue, or Plum Street Temple, I should say, because that's the name that Reform Jews adopted for their places of worship following the early 19th century Reform German tradition. They felt they didn't need to wait for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem to have a proper center for Jewish religious observance. And in America, this became a very popular idea because there was this notion America was the place that Jews were going to come to and stay. It was going to be the end of the Exodus. And they weren't going to wait for the coming of the Messiah, so to speak, to create a new Jewish identity in a accepting pluralistic society. So the Plum Street Temple, it's called that because it's on Plum Street in Cincinnati. Its official name, it was dedicated in 1866 as Congregation Kehila Kadosh B'nai Yeshurun. But today it's known as the Plum Street Temple, but also named after its founder, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who is usually called the founder or the codifier of American Reform Judaism. And this was his creation in almost every way. He wasn't the architect or designer, but he was the force behind it. And the building, as we will see, was intended to express his ideas about what Jews could be or should be in mid-19th century America. It was actually imagined before the Civil War, but not completed until afterwards. So that transformational history of the United States and the terrible war between the North and the South, and the arguments about what is who is human, who is a person, who has equality, who has rights, really about African Americans, but also impacting Jews, was part of the discussion that was taking place and part of the battle that was taking place while this building was in its planning and building stages. So in a sense, the temple that was envisioned by Rabbi Wise already in the 1850s, and that which was realized in the 1860s, while formally the same thing, idealistically it went through transformations. This is a painting. I like to start with this. The building is a very beautiful building, and it's often considered as an object of art in its own right. And this painting, which was done by a local painter, Henry Mosler, at the time of its completion in 1866, really codified that idea and presented the building in a special sort of light, dramatic, theatrical lighting, and as an object in isolation. And it emphasizes its somewhat exotic character for the time. It has these big front arches, these big, what we think of as Gothic arches, but it's sort of encrusted with other decoration. And then it has these two tall towers, minaret type towers, unlike anything seen in America. So it's really a piece of a presentation piece, the building itself, and then the painting too. But what I want to do first, as we investigate the synagogue, is to consider it in a broader context. And I think even Isaac Mayer Weiss saw it that way when he conceived it, and then later it took on a kind of aura as a special place in the history of Reform Judaism that exists out of time and out of place. So it was immediately a sensation when it was built, and just an idea that you should have, that these buildings were not just fixed, a place for Jews to go, and that was it. They were a way for Jews to promote themselves and for communities to promote themselves. And in the 19th century, there was plenty of swag, if you were, the kinds of promotional materials that we associate today with all sorts of events and institutions and universities and corporations. Jewish communities, and not just Jews, everybody, they were doing it back then too. This is nothing new. And this is just an instance of that. This is a piece of sheet music that was printed and presented at the time of the dedication, and a special piece of music was composed for the dedication of the Temple Progress March, which gives you some idea about the progress of America, the progress of Judaism, the progress of Cincinnati. And again, you see this wonderful picture, and here you have it in the context of people walking around and seeing it as a city monument. The idea for this building, though it doesn't exist in isolation, Wise had come from Europe as a immigrant, and first was in Albany and then moved to Cincinnati, where he developed his ideas about a kind of new American Judaism that drew on the past, but really adapted to this new sense of opportunity and integration, and really a nascent modernism too. At that time, American Judaism was very chaotic. There were very few rabbis, and each congregation was sort of going in its own direction. Many were creating their own prayer books. The rites, the rituals were shifting from place to place. You had Sephardi, you had Ashkenazi, you had Jews from Poland, you had Jews from Germany, you had Jews from England. And Wise, when he got to Cincinnati, felt it his mission to try to create some kind of unity in this religious, what he saw as a kind of chaotic situation. And through force of will, through the building of the Plum Street Synagogue, which we'll see, and through the publication of a newspaper called the Israelite, he really succeeded. And eventually this led to the creation of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which was the unifying body for Reform Judaism, which was dominant in the late 19th and early 20th century, and also a whole raft of other institutions. Hebrew Union College, which was the seminary, first seminary in America for Reform rabbis, but for any rabbi. And for a certain amount of time, this creation of Rabbi Wise became the face of American Jewry before the big emigration of Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe, beginning in the late 19th and then continuing into the early 20th century. That's the tradition we talked about when we looked at the synagogue in Chelsea, Massachusetts, some time ago. But Wise was not only responding to the situation in America, he was looking over his shoulder back at Europe, and he was very much influenced by developments in Germany and in Austria. And we know that in his paper, The Israelite, that he'd begun publishing already before the building was completed, there was a report, a letter from Berlin, which kind of said, well, I'm quoting, in Berlin, Jews are building a large and magnificent synagogue, which will be ranked among the most splendid public edifices. And this is the Oranienburger Synagogue, or the Neue Synagogue, which was destroyed during the war, the Holocaust, and it's been restored, partially restored, just the front as a ruin, but as a museum, and also the worship space today in Berlin. But it wasn't completed until 1866, but it was already well known. The designs were well known, and Wise, saw this and obviously was responding to it. So this is an image of the Oranienburger Strasse Synagogue when it was completed. This is the painting that was commissioned for the Plum Street Synagogue, because clearly the same kind of intention of promotion that can be seen here. And Wise was very explicit in his description of that. He wrote already in 1864, as the building was planned, but construction really wasn't taking place because of the Civil War. He wrote that in the Byzantine style, it'll be built with 2 steeples and several minor towers. The building will be truly grand, both in design and dimension. So he was pushing it, he was promoting it from an early stage. In addition to the Oranienburger Strasse synagogue, which we just saw, there were 2 other big European synagogues that had gone up just years before, and that's the so-called Temple Gothic synagogue in Vienna, which you see at the top, and that was also destroyed in the Holocaust. And then the Doheny synagogue, which you see on the left, from the 1850s, the same architect, which still stands and has been beautifully restored. And I think we'll visit it on one of these outings in the future. And then you see the restored Oranienburger synagogue facade down below. So these examples, while they were in Europe, they were becoming well known in America, and they were becoming well known through letters and descriptions like the one that was published in the Israelite. But increasingly, as they were completed, they were illustrated and shown in magazines, in the Jewish press, but really in the larger popular architectural and news press too. The Oranienburger Strasse synagogue, when it was finished, really was one of the most famous buildings in the world, like the Crystal Palace, or today's, like Liebeskind's Berlin Museum. They were transformational. They really changed the way people looked at Jewish buildings and Jewish culture, but also architecture overall. Wise certainly had that idea. This is what he was going to do with the Plum Street Synagogue in America too. Okay, for some reason this is not showing up, this funny slide. So just you'll see a few little pictures here. This is the continuation. Wise had competition in America too. At the same time he was completing his building, Reform Jews in New York were trying to build something just as big and influential, and that's Temple Emmanuel, that was completed afterward in 1868. All right, so that's sort of the general sense. Wise also was competing with other institutions in his home of Cincinnati, and he very much saw the building of this building as a statement for the nation, but also for this more specific locality. And the siting, they bought this plot before the Civil War in the 1850s, intending to build, was intentionally right in the center of the city, and it was an area that was filled with important institutions and especially churches. And so this was a way of having the Jews establish themselves as part of the American religious scene. So I'm just going to show you a few views, but Wise himself was very conscious of this, and he wrote a whole column in the Israelite in which he described the religious setting of the new building. This was published a little bit after the completion, I think in 1868, but he went through every church in the vicinity within just a few hundred meters, and he described the relationship of the building, the new building, to these other ones architecturally, but also religiously. And some of the some of the institutions, nearby institutions, he was very flattering, and clearly these were churches that he had a good relationship with, and others he was not so flattering, and clearly he was not afraid of either continuing acrimonious relations, or he wasn't afraid of speaking out about those who were less than friendly to Jews and in their doctrine. So here we see a good contrast of one of the churches right across the street. We'll see it again. And there were churches all around. There's one behind here. There's one on this corner. There's one across the street. And then Catter Corner. So the view that we're looking at within a few short years would be the location of the new City Hall of Cincinnati. So very, very prominent location. Eventually, this is what the building would look like inside, and we'll come back to this in a minute. And from the conception, this is what it's clear that this is what Wise wanted, but the money wasn't there. So after they built the structure, they had to wait about a decade or more to come up with the funds to do the full decoration. But already in his descriptions from the 1860s, we know that he envisioned what we now call a Moorish decoration inspired by motifs from the medieval Spanish civilization, but translated in through 19th century design principles. And he rationalized this in different ways. And we'll discuss that when we get to the interior. So the form of the synagogue actually is not very radical. It is a basilica type building. We've seen some like that already. 3 aisles, a main central aisle, what we call the nave, and the side aisles smaller. It has octagonal columns, culminates in an impressive apse, which is where the Ark is. This is actually the form of many Romanesque and Gothic medieval churches. A very old form, it goes back to antiquity. And many synagogues in the 19th century, already in the 1840s and 50s in America, were adopting this form. So the structure itself is not radical, it's more the decoration. There are a few little things that are worth noting. And these domes in the aisles are quite unusual, and there are quite a lot of them, and they give a rhythm to the interior that we'll see when we spend more time inside. But they were planned from the get-go, and this would have been something quite new in America, just like the little minarets on the outside. This also would have been unusual and exotic. I mean, if you look at medieval churches in Spain and France, you'll find them, but not in the United States. All right, now let's look at the building in its context, and you can see it here from the back. This is the rear. These are the windows that are stained glass windows of the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, and then the Ark is in this lower part, and you can see it bulges out a bit. This is also quite common in synagogue architecture. It's a way of thickening the wall so that the Ark has greater depth. So when you open the doors of the Ark, there's more room. There's actually a small room, in fact, where the Torah scrolls can be kept. So nothing unusual there. I want you to see, though, that it is right across the street from this very impressive building with a classical portico in a big tower. And then this is the dome building that we saw before in the historic postcard. And then across the street is the city hall that would be built in the 1880s. So the first important building here is the Cathedral of St. Peter in Chains, and this is 1840s. So this is basically a Greek building, but with a Baroque tower on it. And then we have across the street, we have the Unitarian Church, which was built almost at the same time in the 1860s with the temple here, and then the city hall in a big, what we call a Richardsonian Romanesque style, very robust, and that's from the 1880s, and it now dominates the intersection. The Unitarian Church has been destroyed, but the other 3 buildings still stand. So Wise wrote this long piece. I'm not going to read you the whole piece, but I'll just give you a taste of it, in which he talks about the relationship of the temple to these other buildings and the ones around. He talks about religious liberty, corner of 8th and Plum Street in Cincinnati. And he says, if the reader's imagination is sufficiently vivacious, expansive and soaring to have a correct vision of said corner of 8th and Plum Street, he can form a correct and concrete idea of civil and religious liberty, for there is to be seen a picture of which the world at large can offer no parallel, no precedent, no comparison. This was typical of the way Wise wrote, and he was a prolific writer. He wrote pretty much all the newspaper every week, and it went on for years and years and years and years. It's a gold mine for researchers, and it's now been digitized, so I've been digging into it a bit. Really, so he saw this conflation. There's this union of different churches all on one street corner as typical. This is the dream of American pluralism. So just to give you a quick view, this is St. Peter in Chains now. It's one of the most famous buildings in Cincinnati, and it's right across the street. So the flank here of the temple, you can see it. Now you have to remember, this brick was not originally visible. The original design, and if you can remember back to that painting, was a faux stone. It was stucco work over the brick to make this look like a stone building, like the church across the street. This brick was only revealed in the 1960s by historic preservation. It was a new kind of aesthetic. It was a wrong aesthetic, but we see it in a number of buildings of that period. And the Lloyd Street Synagogue in Baltimore, which is from the 1840s, also had a fake stucco, or not fake stucco, had a stucco to look like faux stone. That also was stripped at the time, and one gets a different impression, but they've recently restuck with that. Here we see the Unitarian Church, and you see that classical style against what we're now going to call this Moorish style. Wise talked about this being the Alhambra. He was greatly influenced by Washington Irving's book, Tales of the Alhambra, but he also had been reading Victor Hugo and others. So there's a romanticism, an element of romanticism in his interpretation of the building, but there's a political purpose as well, because Wise bought into this idea that was popular in the mid-19th century, and it gets fully articulated a little bit later by the German historian Heinrich Gratz, of the golden age of Spain, where Jews and Christians and Muslims were able to interact, on good terms equally. They were cohabiting in different cities. We know now that there were tensions back then too, but it is a historical fact that for a certain amount of time, Jews prospered in Iberia before the expulsion in the pogroms of the late 1300s, and then the expulsions in the late 1400s. And it nostalgically, many American Jews thought that was a model that could be recreated in the pluralistic United States, where Jews were treated equally at that time, or almost equally at that time. Just some street views. This is what it looked like then. Now, some of these buildings have been torn down, and it's rather ugly. This is the temple in an old synagogue, in an old photograph with the big office building next door, and now there's a garage there. This is the nearby St. Paul's Cathedral. This is another view from behind. This is the Presbyterian Church, and that's still there, but there's an ugly garage in the middle now too. And then this is the big City Hall that dominates the whole intersection. But because City Hall is there, obviously it's a place that people still go, and because the cathedral is still there, people still go there. So the Plum Street remains a critically important and very visible building in contemporary Cincinnati, even though Jews have left the downtown and moved to different suburbs in different periods. What we have here today, though, is a kind of a shrine to Isaac Mayer Wise, which was kept by the congregation even as they moved to different places. They've moved twice in their history, and they've kept this as a place they could always go back to. And partly because the Hebrew Union College is also in Cincinnati, this temple has had use even when it didn't have a congregation. So it's a place where graduations from the seminary have been held. Now it's been restored and is absolutely stunning. It's beautiful, as you'll see. And people from the congregation they have weddings, and they have bar and bat mitzvahs, and many other simchas are celebrated there, and it's used for many other types of events too. So it does have an active life, and it's also open for visitors, for tourism as well. So this is what it's like inside, and it wasn't until the 1870s, I said, that money was available to paint, and Wise was fortunate enough to find this painter Wenceslaus Stain, who was able to carry out his wishes. It's done with very intricate stenciling, and fortunately, the restorers, when they got involved in the building, were able to find most of the original stencils were still preserved, so they could replicate these, and they could either use originals or make copies to repaint. There have been a few restorations of the interior. We'll look at those in a minute, but we think that what we see today is pretty much what was painted in the 1870s. And most of it is pattern work. It's decorative. It has no specific meaning, but Wise was very intent on having a kind of Jewish didactic educational component as well. So he carefully either composed passages in Hebrew or chose scriptural passages, which were then inscribed all around the temple. And it's interesting that these are all in Hebrew, given the development of Reform Judaism over the coming decades, where American Reform Jews basically moved away from using Hebrew almost entirely in the service and adopted first a German service and then an English service. And today, very few Reform Jews, I think, would be able to understand most of the Hebrew that's inscribed in the structure. So he wrote, and I'm quoting Wise here, "I would here, however, respectfully remind and impress upon the congregation that this is at the time of the dedication in 1866, that although much has been accomplished, a most important part remains to be done in order to entirely complete the edifice. I allude to the fresco painting." It's not actually fresco painting, it's tempera painting. Fresco painting with reference to which the whole idea of the building has been conceived, and without which the whole interior must remain comparatively cold, lifeless, and unfinished. It is but justice to the architect to state that during the entire progress of the work, he has never once lost sight of this important feature, and that over the most trifling detail has been designed with strict reference to the final decoration of the interior in color. So that implies that when the building was designed, they foresaw most of these decorative elements, and they were just completed at a later date. So he'd written that the raised bands, and you're seeing an example here, which form such a marked feature in the building, shall be filled with golden texts from our sacred scriptures. These walls shall glow with patterns of light and warmth and color. Then will the great work be entirely completed. And then he chose the passages, and then one of the teachers from the religious institute, which was then known as the Talmud Yeludim, he actually did the calligraphy. So the painters who did all the rest of the decoration were assisted in this case with someone who could effectively do the Hebrew calligraphy correctly. Wise wrote a lot about this building, and he referenced this idea of the Alhambra, and it suggests where his ideas might have come from, because he uses a quote in one of these passages, which is the Alhambra palace that genius has gilded like a dream and filled with harmony. And the interesting thing is this quote, while it's from Victor Hugo, it's actually used in a very famous book of design called The Grammar of Ornament. It's actually in a book called The Alhambra by Owen Jones, who's best known as the author of The Grammar of Ornament. The Grammar of Ornament was a kind of compendium of all the different types of decorations from every different style of the world. And it was produced in a lavish, huge volume using the new technology of chromolithography. So you could have brilliant colors included. And architects, church architects, synagogue architects, palace, everybody, we use this all the time. But we know that it had a particular influence in synagogue design because it brought what we now call the Moorish style. It codified it into a sort of new language, decorative language, which architects, most of whom were Christian, or almost all of them were Christian, I think, in the 19th century, except for one, adopted into their decorative patterns as something non-Christian, so something exotic that Jews could be comfortable in using, but also Christians could look at without confusion and thinking that they were looking at a church. It's a long story, the Moorish style, because it also plays into stereotypes about Jews as being exotic and being Oriental and being Semitic and being the other in Europe and America. But in some places, and particularly in America, Jews embrace this otherness, and they said, this is we are other and we are Jews and we're proud of it and this is who we are. And the Alhambra was a monument in Spain, in Granada, that people knew. And throughout his life, later on, Wise, really embraced this, dug into it, and continued to talk about his Alhambra temple. So we know that this was not just an arbitrary association. This was something very real and meaningful to him. So as I mentioned, it was only in the 1870s that funds came available to decorate the interior. And first, this guy Wenceslas Thain was brought in, and then these were redone in the 1890s by an Italian team, Raphael and Charles Pedretti, and then they touched up again in the early 20th century. One of the problems in all of these 19th century decorated buildings, and this is true for churches, it's true for government buildings, true for synagogues, and that was the burning of coal. Burning of coal, and then later the smoking of cigarettes creates a film of dirt and grit that covers all this decoration. So over the years, you get a continual darkening of the interior, and that glowing, shimmering quality that Wise talked about was lost. Most recently, in 1995, Jeffrey Green of Evergreen Studios, who's a fantastic restorer of wall paintings, his team spent a long time on this building and restored it to its glory. And I took these pictures just shortly before the pandemic, before COVID, so these are quite recent views. And you can see the designs are unusual. They're not classical. They're not medieval. They're derived from these Islamic patterns. In some way, they also foreshadow, and the Moorish revival was in some ways a foreshadowing of the Art Nouveau style, and then the decorative patterns that get developed in a more geometric way during the Art Deco in the 1920s. And the Moorish style kind of limped along. It had different kinds of revivals and reiterations all through the late 19th and early 20th century. Reform Jews tended to reject it by the late 19th century, and they moved toward classicism. We'll discuss this at another time, but Orthodox Jews then picked it up. So we find even as late as the 1920s, the Yeshiva University in New York using a Moorish style. By that time, Reform and even conservative Jews in America had moved to other types of expression. So here you see the stained glass windows in the above the ark with the Ten Commandments, again significantly in Hebrew. If you look to the Moorish design in Prague, for instance, of the Spanish synagogue, you'll see the numbers are Roman numerals, I believe. So there's a different approach. One of the exciting things in this building is the lighting. There's natural light which comes in from all the windows, and there are stained glass windows, so it gives you this filtered, colored light. Most of the windows have a yellow background, so that emphasizes or strengthens the effect of the gold paint, the gilding in the decoration. You'll see here there are these rows of electric lights around the windows and over the ark, and in the big arch of the ark wall. Electric lighting comes in the late 19th century, but it replaces gas lighting, which was already being used in the 1860s. And we know that one of the innovations in this building and in Temple Emmanuel, and also at the Oranienburger Strasse Synagogue in Berlin, was a real abundance of glass lighting. So this made these interiors even more brilliant than they would have seen just with the decoration. Just as an aside, one of the reasons gold was used a lot, or gold paint, it wasn't real gold, in decorating interiors, because gold and some other metallic finishes reflect light very well. So it was a way to brighten interiors. When you just have candlelight or torches, you've got to elevate, you have to expand lighting any way you can. So if you go to Europe, if you travel in Europe and go to, say, a medieval palace or a Renaissance palazzo, you'll often see these torchères, or you'll see other lights, and behind them will be hammered metal panels, sometimes copper, sometimes, I don't know, some other metal, bronze, and those are there to reflect the light outward. So the light that would come and hit the wall then gets reflected out like a mirror, this is why, so the decoration had that functional way, but you have to have a light source to begin with. So the windows are important, natural light, very important, and synagogues always had a lot of windows because people had to read the Torah, they needed light, but also the idea of illumination is something that is morally or spiritually uplifting. It's, in the beginning was light. God gave, literally, illumination is very important in Judaism, is important too. In the fantastic designs of the late 19th century, gas lighting expanded that. And as soon as possible, gas lighting was replaced with electric lighting. And I have to say, this is something I'm just researching now, because in the early 20th century, we have a whole lot of synagogues with lots of electric lights. It almost looks like you're going to an amusement park. And similar to this design, lots of lights. These are probably LED lights now that have been put in the new building, in the restored building. But these light bulbs over the ark, there were a lot of these done. Immigrant synagogues like Chelsea, we saw them in Chelsea, actually. We saw them at the Chelsea, the Walnut Street Synagogue in Chelsea. They love this. They love this effect. But we have them going back to the 1860s here, 1870s in Baltimore at a synagogue. And we just have to work out how the mechanical process was adapted and evolved in tandem with the aesthetic and the religious sensibilities of the congregations. These go out of fashion by the 1920s. I mean, it's a phenomenon from the late 19th and early 20th century, and then it's gone. It's gone. So something worth considering. So let's wrap up with a few steps through the building. You'll see beautiful chandeliers. These would have been gas originally, and now they are electric. So under the domes, and then this light illuminates the decoration of the domes. There's some detail work. And the artisanship is very high in all of the work. Wise had very high standards, and that's why it took a long time, because he had to raise a lot of money to build this. And during the Civil War, of course, that was almost impossible, but Jews, particularly in cities like Cincinnati, made a lot of money during the Civil War. Many of them were in manufacturing. And one of the things that Jews from an early point of arrival in the United States were involved in was the garment industry, making textiles, and many of the immigrants, this was a skill they brought with them. And during the Civil War, the demand for of the U.S. government was great for uniforms, for canvas, for tents, for all sorts of things. And many other groups were involved in this too, Germans especially, and Jews were part of that world. They were German speaking, but many Jewish companies, we'll say, which were small to begin with, were able to expand during this period, and there was a fair amount of wealth. In general, American cities boomed in the North after the Civil War everywhere, and there was greater wealth. And we see not just synagogues going up, we see a lot of churches and other institutional buildings, a lot of building, a lot of expansion. And Jews were part of this. But it cost a lot of money to build this building. Now, we don't know when the stained glass windows were put in. They were certainly conceived of early. They were part of the original design. Some of them may not have been put in even until the 1890s. It's hard to know. Stained glass is often the last thing that's put into any building that's constructed because it's not structural, and you have to have something in there. You would just have glass, but as money becomes available. But because the stained glass here, most of them are not individually designed memorial windows as we find in some other places, but they're all of the same design. Surely they were part of the whole artistic conception, and they would have been put in, as a unit at some point, probably after the painting though, but we don't know exactly when. And these are just some of the details. So it's a great place to visit and to spend. You can spend really, literally hours. But certainly, if you find yourself in Cincinnati, it's worth a visit to Cincinnati just to see this building. You can revel in its decoration. It's very over the top. If you think of another Reform synagogue we've looked at in this synagogue, which is North Shore Congregation Israel by Minoru Yamasaki from the 1960s, that is radically different, except that it is big and open and it has a lot of space, and it is very it's meant to be awesome. But clearly the distinctive part of this facade are these two towers that rise from the central nave. I called them minarets before, and that's what people often see them as. As in the Jewish tradition, I think these are related to the columns of the temple in Jerusalem. This is the temple in Cincinnati, but the temple in Jerusalem, which we know they were called Yakim and Boaz. We know very little about why they were called that or what purpose they served. And certainly by the time of Herod's temple, the second, or some would say the third temple, really, in the Roman period, when we see depictions of the front of the temple, there are actually 4 columns. But this sense of two columns is symbolic. This is very different from the towers that we see flanking many 19th century synagogues, particularly Orthodox synagogues, which also have that symbolic value, but have the functional purpose of housing stairs. They're stair towers, so the women can go up to the upper galleries. Here, that is not an issue. These are entirely decorative. These are entirely, promotional. And clearly, it's a way to raise the profile of the synagogue in the cityscape, in the skyscape, so that just like churches have their big towers, the synagogue also has its elevated element. I think that's primary. But since synagogues traditionally do not have those towers, what do you do? And in this case, they chose to kind of imitate the towers of Moorish, of Islamic buildings, and put up a minaret. But mosques only have 1 tower, 1 minaret, and then never 2. So this is something that is entirely unique. I hope later on in this series, we'll look at Temple Isaiah in Chicago, which is a Byzantine-inspired synagogue of the 1920s by the Jewish architect Alfred Altschuler. And that was very, it was noted at the time that he included a minaret as well. And he said, well, there's a chimney for the heating element in the building. And so better than having a chimney, I made it look like a minaret, even though our synagogues didn't have minarets. That's not the purpose here, as far as I know. I think these are entirely decorative. So that finishes our visit to the Plum Street Temple, the Isaac Wise Temple in Cincinnati, the flagship of American Reform Judaism. So this is Sam Gruber for CSP. Glad you could join me on today's trip, and we'll explore another place next month. See you soon. Bye.